totally dismissed, but we don't have a legislative system that is effective.
No, I know there's a lot of incompetence, but the social engineers make money off the crises they create, never get in trouble.
But basically, these social engineers, which is the military-industrial complex, we don't have a leader who comes out of the military and the business world. We need that next leader. It's not Hillary. It's not another.
Let me ask you this for the next segment, then. I mean, China's moving artillery into their sandcastle islands they're building. You got the situation with Russia. I mean, the world's really heating up, and I don't...
Let me be frank. I wrote about the Spratly Islands 30 years ago in Pax Pacifica. There we have been doing a pretty good job. CINCPAC, our commanders in the Pacific, has handled that exceedingly well.
Okay, stay there. Explain to us your take, Steve Pieczenik, Dr. Steve Pieczenik, on the situation in the South China Sea and the sandcastles, as the Pentagon calls them. I'm Alex Jones, Infowars.com for breaking news and the tip of the spear info. Really getting crazy. Dr. Steve Pieczenik, StevePieczenik.com, psychological warfare expert, involved in a lot of operations, the Camp David Accords, you name it, been there for so much of history. He's a psychiatrist and also a medical doctor, MIT and Harvard, pretty smart guy, seen a lot. Again, co-authored books with Tom Clancy. He's got a new book out where he breaks down basically a lot of nonfiction information we'll tell you about before he leaves. But finishing up, Dr. Pieczenik, with this larger subject, there is a hubris, there is an arrogance. I know there's a method to their madness. They have plans. But even people that were more competent, like Napoleon and Hitler, obviously failed beating Russia. And I see this disease in elites throughout history, believing that they are basically invincible, infallible. So I think some megalomania has entered the psyche here of the establishment. I know you're a psychiatrist, but looking at this, looking at what's happening in China, look at what's happening around the world, I see a lot of power-tripping megalomania out of other leaders as well. We can't afford to have mistakes like we've had pre-atomic and hydrogen weapons, and it really is scary to see elites running to New Zealand and buying bunkers at record levels. I mean, obviously, the establishment itself's pretty freaked out right now. Is it the debt bubble? Is it the QE? Is it? I mean, why are the establishment running around like chickens with their heads cut off?
Well, number one, we really don't have very much of an establishment. The people in the White House are not very well trained or tutored in psychological warfare or foreign policy. This is one of the weakest White Houses we've had in the past 30, 40 years. But the real issue is there are elements in our Navy and intelligence community that did understand. The book I wrote in Pax Pacifica, the Spratly Islands, the CIA knew about it 20, 30 years ago. Our Navy was effective, and they still are. I mean, they went out there. Now, why is the Spratly Islands important to us? Because China is basically breaking her promise of saying we're not a hegemony. We're not going to be a conquering nation. We're basically a very peaceful country.
We made a deal to give them the Panama Canal, bases everywhere, let them dominate, and now they're double-crossing.
Well, the truth of the matter is we've never believed this storyline, but now they've broken their own narrative by basically going into the Spratly Islands. For most of you out there, the Spratly Islands are a group of islands that have no national security interest to us and none to China, except for the fact that 1,000 miles off of the navigation zone of China, that's 1,000 miles, and they contain a lot of oil beneath those islands, and they're near Vietnam and the Philippines. We have basically been the guarantor of all naval movement, including civilian and military, through the Straits of Malacca, to the China Sea, to the Indian Ocean.
And let's not forget, in the last 2 years, China's basically started having a war out there, grabbing oil rigs and also having ground war on their border with Vietnam, so these two are getting at each other's throat.
Well, the one thing that China has to remember and the world has to remember that the only country that ever beat China in war, not once but twice, was Vietnam. I repeat that again. Vietnam beat the Chinese in a military kinetic action in the 70s twice. And China has to remember that, even though Vietnam is much smaller and looks much more ineffective. I would warn the Chinese that the Vietnamese are far more effective in combat than they would imagine. But China's role is a far more nefarious role. It's an economic domination. What they've done is to break away from the dollar. They've broken away from our currency and our Federal Reserve system so that they can create their own credit system, their own monetary system, and basically go all over the world. What's happened in the process, all of our allies have joined what's called the Asian International Infrastructure Bank, AIIB, which is a spin-off of something called the International Monetary Fund. Without getting too complicated, we are now in a strategic conflict with China, not on a military basis as much as we are on a financial, economic, strategic base, where they're going to Africa and building up roads and infrastructure, and we're going to Africa getting involved in kinetic action or combat, which has no value whatsoever. So when I say gross incompetence, this is really a degradation of our capacity on our own infrastructure, because we need that money to build up our own country, because the greatest national security we've ever had has been our manufacturing capacity, our entrepreneurship, our schooling, and our basic lifestyle.
And we sold that off to the Chinese.
Well, we gave away a lot of that to the Chinese. That is absolutely correct, Alex. Here's a very frightening statistic. There are more advanced scholars in China and than there are students in America. In other words, the Chinese who have studied and gotten up to the college level are far more advanced than all of our students combined. So our education system is faltering.
And it's not in arts and humanities. It's in engineering, chemical engineering.
Chemical engineering, and it's in all the sciences, but also in the humanities. I mean, Chinese know more about our own history. I went to Beijing. There was a 10-story building that was filled with nothing but American politics, American books, and these Chinese kids read them, and they know it. They know our history better than we do. So the real issue now is, where is the leadership coming from? It has to come from below to above. The leaders that have come forth are not really effective. The Bushes, the Clintons, perhaps the Rand Pauls, because he stood up and he showed a moment of courage, which I really applaud. We need more of that. We can't have the rest of the Republican or Democratic Party. We need another party to arise from the grassroots, as you effectively have done to create the Tea Party. That Tea Party was co-opted. But I have faith in the American public that's going to say, look, I don't want to spend money for a war that comes into my area and a military that's totally ineffectual, totally incompetent.
Well, what about this issue? We know we have before a well-trained, patriotic, great soldiers. They're wonderful people. We're not saying they've been defeated, but the missions they were given were impossible to win. They were just to dump money into a black hole for special groups, contractors, and destabilize. That's basically been admitted. But if the globalists and the people that think they're going to have these pipe dreams, they're going to have a civil war in America, try to take our guns, and then have their little socialist brigades back up police and military to go around and arrest veterans and conservatives and libertarians, that will elicit a response that'll be like trying to get, a moose hunting permit. I mean, there'll be no operatives left very quickly. I don't know how insane the establishment is, or maybe the plan is to start a civil war, have us all kill each other, and that's what brings down America. I mean, I'm a lay guy, but I'm on the ground. I've been doing this 20 years. I know how stuff works. There is a narrative in the American psyche of a globalist takeover. People are ready for it. They're not scared. And I just don't think that all these people like George Soros and others understand what they're messing with. I think they take our restraint as weakness. What do you think they're thinking?
Well, let me make the following point. The people in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and California are really not relevant to the rest of the United States. Let me make it very simple. I live in the South. I see states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas. We're all growing. The Midwestern states, the Northeastern states, are dead. California is dead. I mean, Silicon Valley is producing a lot of junk that really doesn't create any effective assets. It's just a variation on the theme. I'm not worried about the Soroses of the world or the Kochs of the world or any one of the so-called demagogues, because when they have to implement any effective action on the local level, particularly with those of us who have guns, who are trained and believe in the Second Amendment, they will back off very quickly. The reason I know that is I can assure you I see policemen on the federal level coming in with vests. And it's absurd, because if you're coming in to offer us a subpoena or a warrant and you're wearing a vest, it's already flagging into people like myself who are not looking for trouble. You're looking for trouble. And in the areas that I live in and the rest of America, those of us who are aware of our Second Amendment rights and our liberties will not tolerate that. The Northeast, the West Coast, it's not relevant anymore. Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, they're finished. Ohio's finished. So you have to look at the states that really are garnering assets and are building up factories. And they really are in Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, because we're right-to-work states.
Why is it the South that everybody bashes and says we're all stupid and idiots all day are the only places growing in America?
Because, we play dumb South. In other words, we allow the Northerners to have their prejudice. We allow them to say what they want, but in effect, we don't pay the state taxes. We don't have unions. We don't have to have 14 different variations of taxes. We're growing economically. Every foreign company that comes into Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. We got more high tech here in the northern area of Florida and in Georgia than we will have in the West. That kind of prejudice will effectively end up in what I call a de facto civil war, which means that the South will rise again economically and politically in a way that the North, the Midwest, and the Northeastern parts can no longer exist.
Well, if you look at the old Civil War, the first one, the North won because it was the industrial power with about 10 times the industry, and the British pulled out on funding the South. I wouldn't have supported the South or the North. The whole thing was a big tragedy, obviously, to control Western expansion. It was a fight over two different power blocks and almost happened under Andrew Jackson. But undoubtedly, it's sad to see what socialism and corrupt government has done. And not that the South is perfect or Texas, the gateway to the West. But, I mean, the values on the West Coast and the East Coast are gone. These people are zombies on average. And I just can't believe all these Californians. I know they're not Californians. They're folks that went to California and failed. They come here, and then they want to jack up taxes and recreate what they just left.
Well, the fact of the matter is people like myself who shot films there and would start up companies, when we have to have a special broker in California in order to pay our California taxes, forget the regular taxes, then we pull out. I mean, California is just a question of basically of evaporating, literally. I mean, they have a drought. They have not dealt effectively with their drought. They will have no water. The water is...
The left wouldn't let them build reservoirs 30 years ago. They're suicidal.
Well, that's their own self-destructiveness and their own arrogance.
You're a psychiatrist. I wanted to ask you, what is up, and I'm not judging people, but obsessively pushing men wearing dresses. Now they're saying we should pay for people to mutilate themselves. In fact, what's the name they give it? They call it transabled, cutting your arms and legs off. The new moral standard is to not care and be evil. The new moral standard is to be a loser, to be a slacker. This is what's being pushed at universities and everywhere. Is this just the end consequence of spoiled, rotten kids having spoiled, rotten kids and decadence, Dr. Pachenik?
Well, what's happening is coming in as a media penetration of a sense of neutralizing our male dominance. It's an attempt to basically neutralize the testosterone that we've had in the past in this country, and you have things like genders, which I don't agree with. I really would question all the surgeons who go into transgender surgery. I've always questioned it. 30 years ago when John Hopkins started it, I said these people have psychiatric problems. It's not a question of just identity, and it's not just a question of what they are to themselves. However, it's not my problem, but it is my problem when I have to pay for that. I will not pay for those tranny experiments or the transgender transformations. That's their problem. That's not my problem.
And let's expand. Now they're saying people don't feel good with their arms and legs. We got to pay to have those cut off so they can have fetish sex with the limbs.
Well, that's going clearly to the extremes, but the bottom line that we have to go back to is the common sense.
No, but this, sir, I know it's to the extremes. It's being pushed in the national Post. This, watch. This is the next mass mental illness.